welcome back. Once again, we have a terrific story. I'm actually really excited about this one. I was introduced to Gerry, and it was a Mississippian. And I don't know that I've ever recorded anything with somebody who has a label of a Mississippian. And then all of the things that are going to go into this. I'm actually really excited to hear some of the stories and all the things that are going on. But let's get started with what we usually do. So, first of all, thank you. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for taking the time. I appreciate that. Thank you for being a part of this podcast.
Thank you, Tim. I'm delighted to be here.
So then the second part of this is, who is Gerry? You got 30 seconds. We just stopped in an elevator. We just happened to meet. And if I were to ask you, who is Gerry, what would you say in a real quick 30-second kind of scenario?
Okay. Gerry Wilson is a late blooming 82-year-old debut novelist, a retired high school English and creative writing teacher, mother of 4, stepmother to 2, grandmother of 7, stepmother to 3 more, avid reader, sometimes gourmet cook, lover of music, who is living her best life in what she calls her third act. I like to call it.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that.
Lifelong Mississippian with deep roots, and that itself is very complicated.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. And so I have to share this one story. I've only been to Mississippi a few times, and the one time that I was there I was in the middle of the summer. We were in Biloxi, and for some reason, my company decided to sponsor a golf tournament in the middle of the summer, in the middle of the heat, with all of it was over 100 degrees, and I don't know why we were even out on the golf course in the middle of the afternoon, but I think I fried all the way down to my bones. It was so hot. It was not a good thing I'm a northerner, so it was even harder. But
it's hard on us, Tim, too, sometimes, especially the last couple of summers. Last summer we had a terrible drought and temps 105, 110 real temperature. It was really, it can be.
I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
Oof. Well, we in the North, we complain about the cold. People in the South, they complain about the hot. So, I mean, we try to balance it out and see where it goes. So, well, let's get started. And we always divide this up into 3 sections. And the first section that we talk about is what you thought. And you mentioned earlier in the introduction, you're now in your 3rd act. So I'm assuming that means there was a lot of twists and turns and probably bends in the road that you have taken. But what was it like? What did you think your adult life was going to be like as a child before you stepped into that? What were the narratives that you had to adapt, or were examples to you, or things that people have told you? What was the life like for Gerry growing up?
Well, I was an only child, and I didn't get real perspective on that until I was probably 40 and seeing a therapist, more than likely. When I remembered something that my dad always said, when people would ask him how many children he's had, he would say, just one, my daughter. He'd say, she's all in the world we ever wanted. And it didn't really dawn on me until I was an adult how complicated that was and what the expectations were. I had a wonderful childhood, really. My parents really doted on me. I was probably spoiled rotten. But neither of them had gone to college. So I was the first person in my family to go to college. And so they did want things for me. And that set up a lot of expectations. But the other side of that is, I think my vision of my life growing up was that I would marry somebody really nice who would take care of me really well, and I would be a wife and mother, and that would be my life. And I mean, obviously that happened to some extent, but then things changed around all that and forced me to change my perspective.
So it sounds like you had several different, I don't want to say competing narratives, but there were definitely some things on your life that were placed. And forgive me for saying this, I'm making big jumps and big assumptions. But for example, you said it complicated. There was a lot of pressure. So maybe they were pushing you to, like you just mentioned, you were the first person to graduate from college. Did they push you into that, or was that just something you accepted? Was it something that you wanted to do? Was there perfectionism that you had to deal with? And you said potentially even in your 40s, the therapy kind of realized some of the stuff that was going on.
Yeah, yeah. Well, going to college was something that I wanted.
Mm,
Um, and nobody ever said to me outright, well, you have to make all A's, or
mm,
you have to play the piano well, or whatever, whatever they put in my path, because they did, they sacrificed for me. They worked really, really hard. My dad worked 6 days a week from 6 in the morning till 6 at night. He had an automobile parts store. And so they were very hardworking folks, and they did give me a lot. And nobody ever said, you have to do these things. And yet I felt it. I internalized it somehow. Um, but I can also remember, I wrote a piece the other day for my Substack blog about imposter syndrome that
mm.
has to do now with my feelings about being an author. And I still get these feelings sometimes, well, that's not really me. You know, if people really knew me, they wouldn't say that about me. And I remember having those feelings as a child. And so, yeah, it was complicated, and I love them dearly, and they loved me, and they gave me a really good home. And
Mm.
so I'm not complaining, because most of us have complicated childhoods in one way or another.
And I love that attitude that you have there because, like you said, it's just part of how we're growing up. And then you learn, oh, well, I just picked it up. Like you just mentioned, like nobody ever told me I had to do straight A's. Nobody ever told me I had to do something really, really well. You just internalized that and you accepted it and then
Hmm.
just made that part of your narrative. And so, was that, can you, like, if you dived into that part of it, what was the impression? Is it, you had to work hard? Like, where did that come from?
Well, I had a work ethic set in front of me. So I suppose there was that. And I did have to work hard, but I was smart.
Mm,
I liked school, I liked learning. Um, I even liked writing when I was little. And then I got away from that for about 40 years. Um, but yeah, I did have to work at it, but I didn't struggle, I'll put it that way.
gotcha.
Um, I happened to be pretty talented at the piano as a little girl, and then played a piano recital when I was 14. Um, and so there was that, and then that fell by the wayside. Other things took its
Hmm.
place. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you were to sum up, you say, hey, my narrative for my life, and there's probably some good things in there, but if you were to sum up what the narrative of your life prior to some of the different perspective shifts and prior to some of the things that you started just really focusing and saying why, what would be that summary? What would be the narrative that you felt you were compelled to live, whether or not somebody spoke it or whether or not somebody verbalized it to you?
First of all, to be a good girl, that would have been primary, and that involved, I guess, doing well. Succeeding.
So in other
Yeah.
to be a good girl meant that you had to succeed. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, that's part of it.
What was the other
Yeah.
part?
Don't let them down.
Hmm.
Don't let them down. And
Yeah,
nobody ever said that to me either, but I think that's what I internalized.
yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
can I can totally see that. So, how did that impact your life moving forward? Was it a strive for perfectionism? Was it? I mean, it sounds like you had a really good work ethic, which is the positive that you can take away from the childhood. But stepping into that, what was the bad side of it? I'm sure there's a lot of good side to it, but what was the bad side that you had to overcome?
Oh, the perfectionism, definitely. Um, I was a perfectionist probably by the time I was 5 or 6 years old,
Mm.
although I had a very vivid imagination. And that has followed me. That's followed me all of my life. I still am. I still I still have to deal with that. Although I'm a lot more realistic, I think now than I was some years ago.
Right, right. So, in that process, was there an event, a circumstance, or something that just kind of made you wake up or made you realize, like, look, I do not have to be perfect? Was there some kind of a scenario that just allowed you to shift that perspective from being the absolute perfect person compared to the reality that we all fail and that we all mess up?
Well, there were several things, but there was one thing I guess that set that in motion, and that was when my first marriage failed. Um, I had married a boy who was still in medical school. Um, he graduated. He did well. He became a surgeon. We had a really good life. We had four little boys, and things were just rocking along until he decided he didn't want to be married anymore, and it just shook me to my core. Um, and I took on, obviously when something like that happens, everybody bears responsibility. It's not just one person, but I took that just like a punch in the gut,
Mm.
and really took on so much blame for that, and felt really helpless in light of it because my life was all planned out, you know. Um, and then all of a sudden it wasn't. I remember being so shaken, and I had just no self-esteem whatsoever. I had trouble looking somebody in the eye and carrying on the conversation that first year or two after that happened. So I had to dig my way out of that. And my parents died within 3 years of each other, right around that same time. So it was like all the underpinnings went, you know, at the same time. Um, and one funny little thing that happened was I got a job teaching in a preschool. And this woman who became a really dear friend pulled me aside one day, just a few months after we separated. And she just almost shook me by the shoulders. She said, "You've got to stop this. You've got to get hold of yourself. You can't let this ruin your life." And I said, "It's not that easy." But she was right. She was right. It just takes time to
Mm.
come back from something that sort of shatters your image of what you think your life is going to be. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you're looking at that, the you mentioned several things in there. First of all, I talked about the fact that it pretty much shattered the self worth and self value. It shattered that perspective of this is the way life is going to go. It shattered probably some of the stability. It shattered a lot of the things that you thought were going to be the way life was, and
Mm-hmm.
brought it back down. Can you look back and say this hurt, but examples like what that other individual did for you and kind of shook you a little bit and said, "Hey, you need to work out of that." Are there things that you can look back on and say, "This was how I took that first step in reestablishing my value and reestablishing some stability and rebuilding who I thought I was going to be"?
Oh, absolutely. Um, because I guess really deep down, I was pretty tenacious. And I had my children, and that was, I sort of had to try to get my act together for them. But the interesting thing is that looking back on it, it's what turned me to teaching. I guess I would have been a stay-at-home mom, barring something else unforeseen. I might have been a stay-at-home mom forever, and there's nothing wrong with that. I have plenty of friends who have done that in their lives and have done it well. Um, but it forced me outside of that mold. And as I said, I got this little part-time job initially while I went back to school and got a master. Back then you had to have a teacher's license
Mm.
in order to teach in Mississippi. So I did that first, and then once I had done that, I went back to school and got a master's degree in English. And I was still working the little preschool job at that time. And I look back on that and I realize how fortunate I was in so many ways because, I wasn't destitute. I wasn't left without any resources or any support, any backup,
Right.
both emotionally, financially, whatever. But eventually, I wound up taking a job as a high school English teacher, and that kind of turned out to be my thing. I started a creative writing program at the school where I taught, and that became my thing, really, because I saw that the kids were being taught to write, but they weren't being taught to discover their. It sounds such a cliche to say discover their voices, but that's true.
Mm.
To write about, write from the heart, write about who they really are, find some depth in what they have to say. And so that turned out to be me after all. I remember one more quick story.
Yeah, please share.
Yeah. I was going for counseling, and what I thought I wanted to do was I wanted to get a social work degree, a master's in social work. My background was I was an English and psychology major, and I loved psychology. I just thought that was all so cool. But the counselor looked at me and said, "Oh, you're 40. You're too old to do that. The field is too crowded. You're too old." And I took that so to heart that I changed course, probably not for the right reasons. Because it would have been perfectly fine for me to go to graduate school in social work. Where he was coming from with that, I don't know. But I did take it to heart and I rethought it and went the teaching route, which has probably turned out to be the best thing for me. It's led to my writing life.
Absolutely. But
Mm-hmm.
but it's interesting. You look back on that. Is there pain that's associated with that, or did you feel like that you were? And that's what this whole program is about, and the podcast, and those that are listening is choosing to live the narrative and choosing to create your narrative as opposed to living somebody else's narrative, or as opposed to living what you thought you were supposed to do growing up. So when you look at that, if your first passion was psychology, did you feel like he was directing you away from your original passion, or did you feel like he was being more of a coach and trying to draw out that greatness that good coaches do? Like,
I don't know. I can't look back and read his mind. I don't know what his motivation was.
mm,
The sad thing about it was that I didn't question it.
mm,
It's like with creating a fictional character, you don't want your character to be too passive. You don't want the character to be acted upon. You want the character to be somebody who acts, who does things, who makes choices even if they're wrong. And so I was sort of pushed into that decision, just like I was pushed into the end of the marriage.
mm.
But they were baby steps. They were baby steps for me to figure out, who I really wanted to be when I grew up. Yeah.
Yeah. So, do you liken yourself to some of the characters in the book? You just made a really interesting comment there, which I want to explore this just for a second. You said you want the characters to be making decisions rather than to be
Yeah.
acted upon or be forced into a situation or scenario. Uh, can we go a little deeper there?
Yeah, sure. That comes from, I guess, I struggled with the main character in this novel that just got published. She's a young woman. It's 1918. She's uneducated. She lives way out in the country. Um, she gets pregnant with an illegitimate child and refuses to name the father. And so her circumstances are so limited. And so her circumstances are shaping who she is, but it's how she responds to those circumstances and how she acts on them that make her an interesting character. Um, and I struggled with that early on. I found myself writing things happening to Leona, things happening to Leona, things happening to her. And granted, things happen, but it's how she picks herself up and manages to go move on and make a life for herself and her child.
So
That are most important.
how does that apply to us in our daily lives? Because fiction and reality, they often, it's like this beautiful web that's weaved and they kind of intertwine at times and then they kind of separate out and then they come back together. So how does those types of concepts and thoughts, how does that impact us on in our daily lives?
Don't we all get knocked down and we have to get back up somehow? Um, we may be in despair in the moment, but um, somehow we find a way to climb back out of that. Um, I remember when my mother was got a terminal diagnosis. She was dying with cancer, and my grandmother, her mother, was still alive, and um, I remember being with my mother in the hospital and then driving the 20 miles to her home where my grandmother lived and crying all the way, thinking, how am I going to deal with this? How am I going to tell her what's going to happen to her? How am I going to take, you know, and somehow um, I might bang on the steering wheel and scream a little bit, but somehow by the time I got to her, I was able to put that behind me
Mm.
and deal with the moment. Yeah. And I don't know of anybody in this life who doesn't have moments like that. Yeah.
So how is this? And let's transition into how you're living your life now and the values that you hold and how you're creating the narrative of your current life. Um, I just love the concept of what you've been talking about in the creative writing, where people are finding their voice, and then some find it through the fiction aspect. But what are the things that you value now? What are the things that you use to write and craft your narrative and your story, the legacy that you want to leave behind?
Oh my goodness, that's the hardest question. Um, First, I have to say it's one day at a time. Uh, at my age, coming off a broken hip last summer, it's just one thing or another. Um, but I have to say that I do a lot of self talk,
Mm.
and this goes back to um, I've always felt like no matter how old I get, I'm still that 6-year-old little girl deep inside. And this goes back to what I said earlier about my childhood. I think um, I have to talk to myself about believing in myself. I'm still a little bit stunned that I've actually published this novel. It's that feeling of, well, gosh, does somebody really think that's good? Even though I felt deep down that it was a good story
Mm.
and I felt good about it. But it's that's the trap of needing somebody else's affirmation. And I still struggle with that. But this is going to sound like a cliche, I guess, but I take joy in my life now. Um, I'm a little bit amazed that I'm 82 years old.
Mm.
Um, I take joy in my children, my sons, and my grandchildren. My oldest grandson's getting married in July. So that's another milestone.
Yeah.
As far as the work is concerned, the writing, I'm still plugging away. I have a couple of novel drafts that need the same kind of attention that I finally, in the summer of 2021, I went during COVID, when I was sort of desperate for something to do, I pulled what became this novel out and gave it a really tough revision. And I have work that needs that. I have um, a collection of short stories that is about 2/3 finished. Um, I've discovered this late in my life that I really enjoy writing memoir,
Mm.
and I've been doing some of that in my Substack. I have a Substack called Stories I'm Old Enough to Tell, um, which is true. Um, so I'm enjoying doing that. Um, my second husband is a joy in my life, and we're
So
doing well.
it sounds like there is a complete focus on finding what is good. And everything that you just
Yes,
talked about, the joys that you have in your life, you seek out what is good and you focus on that. Is that a fair statement?
that's a fair statement. I wish it were totally true, but I'm afraid it's not. I'm a worrier.
Hmm.
That's where the self talk comes in.
Yeah.
To Yeah, I've always been a worry,
Yeah.
a what if kind of person. But that's where the fiction writing comes in too. Is playing what if.
Wow. Yeah. So on all of this, if you could come down and say, this is the number one thing that I have found to be the most impactful in my life right now, what would you say that number one thing would be?
Oh my goodness, Tim. I don't know. That's hard.
If you come up with two or three, that's fine because I understand sometimes an impact happens in a business, sometimes impact happens in a family. There's different ways that impact happens. So,
Well, I suppose just the fact that we're here still. There's no guarantee of that. My faith plays a role. Um, the idea of legacy plays a role. Um, I like to think about what my adult grandchildren's lives are going to be like, and what um, maybe I've contributed something
mm,
to that. Um, I like the fact that my books are a legacy, that there's something that I put out into the world.
mm,
Um, they're mine.
yeah. So, and I'm going to ask you one more deep question. Usually, I ask like, what would you want to leave behind for the audience? But I'm going to ask you this question because I can sense this is really, really passionate for you. If your grandkids were sitting in front of you, what would be the one thing that you would want your grandkids to glean or learn from you? What would be that one component?
Never give up. Never give up.
Hmm.
Keep the faith in yourself.
And what if they showed doubt in themselves? What would you say to them?
Hang on to what's good, because it passes. I mean, that's the tragedy of young people who bottom out and even take their own lives, is that they don't have the perspective to see that even something that hurts really, really badly, you may never get over it totally, but it fades into the background. And to give up everything because of that one thing is just such a tragic waste.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I love that. I think we're going to end on that. So, for those that want to follow you, find your novel, find the things that you're doing, and it sounds like you're going to produce a lot more writing. So, we're going to have to definitely put that in there. And I'm excited about that. I think that's awesome. It's just like, hey, this is just honestly the rising of a new sun. So, it sounds like this is, like you said, your third life. How can people get in contact with you?
My website is, do you want the full address? It's www.gerrygwilson, Gerrywilson.com.
Perfect.
The Substack column, as I said, is Stories I'm Old Enough to Tell.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also on Instagram and Facebook, and I can send you those if you would
Oh,
like.
absolutely. We'll get that stuff in the notes for connecting purposes.
Okay.
So especially those that are listening, a lot of times they are listening in the car, can't write things down. So we always make sure we get that in the notes. So
Into the notes.
yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. So we want to make sure we've got that ready for everybody. Is there anything else you want to add? Anything else that's just on your heart? Like, hey, I need to share this one thing.
I don't think so. I mean, this was had a lot of depth to it. I hadn't really thought about these things in this concentrated kind of way
Mm,
in a while. I mean, I think about it all the time because um, even though the situations are not specific to my life, um, the emotions are similar
yeah,
when I'm writing fiction.
absolutely.
So it's always there. It's always there in the background.
Yeah,
But it's really interesting and helpful to try to put it into words
yeah.
and talk about it. Yeah.
That's just incredible. So again, thank you for sharing with us today. Thank you for allowing us to get kind of that peek into who and how you were created and the narrative that you're writing. I mean, like, I'm honestly honored to be in your presence. I appreciate that so much.
Thank you, Tim, so much. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, that's awesome. This has been fun. This has absolutely been fun. For those listening, again, make sure you keep crafting and creating your narrative, because each story is worth telling, especially when it's your own. So keep crafting, keep writing, create your narrative, because it is definitely of value to someone.